The sun was a hammer in the sky. It beat down on the dusty edge of town, on the raw wood of a freshly built cross. And on that cross, a young woman was bound, wrists stretched, ankles tied tight. Her clothes were gone, ripped away piece by piece until she was naked to the judgment of the sun and the town. Her skin was already turning a painful red, her chest heaving with breaths that were half sobs, half gasps for air. The heat was a fire, but the shame was 1,000 times worse. Dozens of eyes stared, cold and blank. This wasn't just a punishment. It was a show, a Sunday spectacle. People whispered, their voices like dry leaves skittering in the wind. Some crossed their arms, faces grim. Others nodded, satisfied that this was justice, swift and righteous. And above them all, holding his Bible like a shield, was the preacher. His voice sliced through the shimmering heat. "This girl carries the devil within her," he thundered, his voice ringing with a terrible certainty. "She resisted the hand of the Lord, and now the Lord will cast the evil out." He turned, his face aglow with a holy fire that didn't look holy at all, and pointed a long, bony finger at the bound girl. "The sun will burn the wicked spirit from her flesh. Her shame will cleanse her soul." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. They believed him. They always believed him. The girl, Ilara, twisted against the ropes. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from a rage so deep it felt like it would split her in two. Tears carved clean paths through the dust on her cheeks, but her voice was a razor. "I am no devil!" Her cry was sharp, ragged. "He tried to touch me, he tried to shame me, and I fought him. Now he calls me a witch." The words hung there for a second, and then the crowd laughed, a dry, cruel sound. To them, the preacher's word was gospel. Hers was just the hiss of a snake. Ilara's head fell forward, her dark hair sticking to her damp skin. The preacher, Reverend Blackwood, began to circle the cross, slow and deliberate, like a vulture. His eyes gleamed with a chilling power. He spread his arms wide, a dark angel in a black coat. "Look upon her, good people," he boomed. "This is what becomes of sin. This is how God purges darkness from our land." Ilara strained against the ropes again, every muscle screaming. "Please," she shouted, her throat raw. "Someone listen. This is not God's will. This is his crime." But her voice was swallowed by his sermon. The crowd shuffled closer, their faces hungry. The sun climbed higher, a merciless white eye in a cloudless sky. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and judgment. Every stare was a physical blow, but no one stepped forward. No one reached to loosen the ropes. Not a soul. Blackwood lifted his Bible again. "She will break," he promised them. "She will beg for forgiveness, and when she does, the demon will flee her body." Ilara's eyes snapped open. She shook her head, a wild, violent motion. Her voice was barely a whisper now, but it carried. "I will not break. I will not surrender. This is not God. This is you." Her defiance sent a tremor through the crowd. For a single, fleeting moment, there was silence, only the sound of her ragged breathing. Blackwood's face went dark. His perfect authority had been challenged. He slammed his palm against the rough wood of the cross, right next to her head. "Then the sun will answer in my place," he spat, his voice low and venomous. Ilara closed her eyes. The ropes cut into her skin. She was alone, humiliated, but unbroken. They thought they were watching a devil burn, but the real devil was the one holding the Bible. And the truth of how she got here was uglier than any sin they could imagine. It had all started less than an hour ago, in the cool, quiet shadows of the town chapel. She'd only gone inside for a moment of peace. The chapel was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of safety from the relentless sun and the prying eyes of the town. She knelt in the front pew, her head bowed, trying to find a prayer in the suffocating silence. That's when she heard the heavy footsteps behind her. Reverend Blackwood. He didn't come to pray. At first his voice was smooth as oil. He asked if she felt the Lord's presence. He asked if she trusted him, her spiritual guide. His words were a cloak, hiding the predator underneath. She nodded, her eyes still closed, wanting to believe in the goodness of the place, the goodness of the man. Then his hand was on her shoulder. It wasn't a comforting touch. It was heavy, possessive. He leaned closer, his breath hot on her neck, whispering things that had no place in a house of God. Words about cleansing her of worldly temptations, about showing her a more physical path to grace. She pulled away. "Reverend, please." His grip tightened. "Do not be afraid, child, this is a blessing." His other hand moved to her waist, pulling her back against him. That's when the fear turned to ice, and then to fire. She wasn't a child. She was a woman, and she knew what this was. She spun around, pushing him hard. "Get away from me!" His face changed. The mask of piety fell away, revealing something cold and reptilian. He wasn't used to being denied. He lunged for her. She fought back with a fury he never saw coming. She wasn't one of the meek town girls who bowed their heads and obeyed. She clawed at his arm, her nails digging deep. She kicked, she twisted, and when he grabbed her wrist, she bit down on his hand. Hard. He howled, staggering back, clutching his arm. There was a dark, ugly mark on his wrist where her teeth had been. His eyes were wide with shock and fury. He looked at the bite mark, then at her, and in that instant, a new plan formed behind his cold eyes. He saw his path to ruin, and he chose another. He turned and stormed out of the chapel, not in shame, but in triumph. He held his Bible high, his bitten hand hidden in the folds of his sleeve. He burst out into the sunlit square and cried out to the townspeople. "The devil has taken hold of her!" he screamed, his voice filled with a convincing terror. "She attacked me. The spirit of a demon is inside her. It must be driven out by the light of God's own Son." The people gasped. They saw their trusted preacher, a man of God, looking panicked and righteous. They didn't see the fresh scratches on his arm. They didn't see the guilt in his eyes. They only saw what he wanted them to see. By the time Ilara stumbled out of the chapel, her dress torn, her arms bruised from his grip, the verdict had already been delivered. The crowd was a wall of faces, hard and unforgiving. Her protests were nothing. Her screams were just the devil's lies. When she spat the truth, that he had attacked her, they laughed. A preacher? A man of God? Impossible. A young woman, an outsider with no family in this town? Far more likely she was the sinner. So they seized her. They dragged her to the edge of town, to the cross they kept for just such occasions. They tied her up and called it God's work. And now here she was, the ropes biting deep, her skin on fire, her body shaking from exhaustion and rage. Blackwood stood before his flock, his voice booming. But if you looked close, you could see a tiny bead of sweat on his temple. You could see the slight tremor in the hand he kept hidden. He'd won, but it was a fragile victory. Someone in that crowd had to have questions. Someone must have seen something. But no one spoke. Fear was a gag in their mouths. Ilara forced the words out, her voice a croak. "He tried to take me. He failed. Now he calls me the devil." Her words fell like stones into a well, but the crowd refused to hear them splash. Blackwood's voice rose again, louder, more powerful, wrapping them all in his web of fear and faith. It seemed like no one would ever listen. And then, a sound. Faint at first, but growing stronger. A steady beat cutting through the preacher's sermon. The rhythmic sound of horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth. Heads started to turn. Who was it? Who would dare ride into the middle of a holy cleansing? The sound grew louder, closer. A cloud of dust rose at the edge of the crowd. A lone rider. As he came into view, a ripple of unease went through the townspeople. This wasn't some stranger passing through. This was a man they all knew, though most hadn't seen him up close in years. Silas, a rancher from the high country, his face weathered like old leather, his beard streaked with gray. He was in his 50s, but his shoulders were still as broad as a barn door. He swung down from his horse with a slow, deliberate grace. It was the movement of a man who measured every action, who had seen too much to ever be rushed. Whispers broke out. "It's Silas!" "What's he doing here?" Because Silas wasn't just a rancher. He was a veteran of the war, a man who had seen hell and walked back out. He had earned his respect with blood and sweat long before Blackwood ever came to town with his fancy words and his dark coat. Silas walked into the circle of people, his boots making a soft crunching sound in the dirt. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes went straight to Ilara on the cross. He saw the trembling, the raw skin, the exhaustion, but he also saw the unbroken fire in her eyes. Then, his gaze shifted to Reverend Blackwood. Silas's jaw was tight, but when he spoke, his voice was calm and dangerously low. "What in God's name are you doing?" Blackwood puffed out his chest, his authority challenged. He raised his Bible higher, as if it could ward off this intrusion. "This is holy work, Silas. We are cleansing a sinner. The devil has taken root in her flesh, and we are saving her soul from eternal damnation." Silas's gaze didn't waver. He looked back at Ilara. "Is that true, girl?" Her voice was raw, cracked but clear. "No, he tried to shame me. In the chapel. I fought back, and now he calls me a witch." The words landed with a heavy thud. The crowd shifted, their certainty wavering for the first time. You could feel the doubt spreading like a crack in the ice. But Blackwood was quick. He barked out a laugh, a sharp, ugly sound. "Do not listen to her lies. That is the devil's tongue speaking through her, trying to poison your hearts." Silas's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, swept over the faces in the crowd. Men and women he'd known his whole life. He saw the flicker of doubt in some, the blind, stubborn faith in others. He let the silence hang in the hot air for a long moment before he spoke again, his voice still quiet, but carrying to every ear. "I've seen real devils, Reverend." He paused, letting the words sink in. "They don't look like a half-starved girl tied to a cross. They look like men who hide their own sins behind the word of God." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a direct challenge. Blackwood's hand, the one Ilara had bitten, twitched at his side. Silas saw it. A few others in the crowd saw it too. A fresh, angry red mark on the preacher's skin, a mark he had tried to conceal. Fear still kept them silent, but now it was a different kind of fear. The fear that they had been wrong. Horribly wrong. Blackwood's face turned purple with rage. His voice rose to a screech. "Silence him! He speaks blasphemy! He is an agent of the devil, sent here to protect his own kind." The crowd swayed, caught between the preacher's fury and the rancher's cold calm. Ilara's eyes were locked on Silas, and for the first time since they'd dragged her from the chapel, a flicker of something that looked like hope ignited in their depths. It was a plea, not just for her life, but for the truth. But Blackwood wasn't finished. He pointed a trembling finger at Silas. "This man has always been a thorn in the side of this community. He lives alone, shuns our church, and fills his head with worldly ideas. He is no friend to God." He was trying to turn them, to make Silas the new enemy. "He is interfering with God's work." A few men in the front of the crowd, Blackwood's most loyal followers, puffed out their chests. They were simple men, farmers and blacksmiths, who relied on the preacher for guidance, and they saw this as a test of their faith. One of them, a big man named Jebediah, took a step forward. "You heard the Reverend, Silas. Move along. This ain't your business." Silas didn't even look at him. His eyes were still locked on Blackwood. "When a man uses God's name to torture a girl in the public square, it becomes every decent man's business." And that's when he did something no one expected. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the cross, not toward Blackwood, toward Ilara. His message was clear. He wasn't there to argue, he was there to act. "Stop him!" Blackwood shrieked. "The blasphemer is trying to free the demon!" Jebediah and another man moved to block Silas's path. They were big men, used to hard labor, but Silas had been forged in a different kind of fire. He didn't stop walking. He didn't raise his fists. He just looked at them, his eyes holding a weariness that was more intimidating than any threat. "Jebediah," he said, his voice soft, "I knew your father. He was a good man. He would be ashamed to see you here today doing this." The words struck the big man like a physical blow. He faltered, his resolve crumbling. The other man looked back at the preacher, suddenly unsure. The preacher's spell was breaking. He could feel it. The crowd was no longer a single-minded mob. It was a collection of individuals, and they were starting to think for themselves. In his desperation, Blackwood made his next move. "He leaves me no choice!" he cried, his voice taking on a sorrowful, martyred tone. "He forces my hand. The evil in him is too strong. It must be met with righteous force." He nodded to two other men, leaner, meaner types who hung around the saloon more than the church. They were not men of faith. They were men who enjoyed cruelty and followed the strongest power. They didn't hesitate. They rushed at Silas from both sides. The crowd gasped. This was it. The violence that had been simmering under the surface was finally boiling over. But the fight was over before it even began. Silas moved with a speed that defied his age. A step back to avoid the first man's clumsy swing, a quick pivot, an elbow that caught the second man under the chin. Both men went down in a heap, groaning in the dust. Silas hadn't even drawn a weapon. He hadn't needed to. A stunned silence fell over the square. The town had just seen the difference between a loud voice and true strength. Blackwood's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. His power, built on words and fear, had just been shattered by a quiet man's actions. He looked around wildly, searching for another loyal face, another pair of hands to do his bidding. But the faces that looked back at him were now filled with doubt, with suspicion. They had seen the bite mark. They had heard Silas's words, and they had just seen him take down two men without breaking a sweat. And that's when another voice cut through the silence, a voice of official authority. "Enough!" The crowd parted. Sheriff Brody stood there, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. His badge glinted in the sunlight. He was a practical man, not given to sermons or spectacle. He had been watching from the edge of the crowd, letting things play out, gauging the temper of the town. Now, he had seen enough. He looked at Silas, then at Blackwood, his jaw set in a hard line. "This ritual," he said, the word tasting like poison in his mouth, "is over. Cut her down, Silas." Blackwood's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "Sheriff, you can't. She is a vessel of evil. The law of God is higher than the law of man." Sheriff Brody took a slow step forward until he was standing right in front of the preacher. He was shorter than Blackwood, but he seemed to take up all the air between them. "The only law in this town that matters right now is mine, Reverend, and my law says you don't tie women to crosses and leave them to bake in the sun. Not today. Not ever." His gaze was like iron. Blackwood, for the first time, looked truly afraid. The crowd was silent, watching, waiting. The moment was turning. The tide of power was shifting right there in the dust. Silas pulled a knife from his belt and walked to the cross, his back to the preacher, his trust entirely in the sheriff. He began to saw at the thick ropes binding Ilara's wrists. But Blackwood wasn't a man who accepted defeat. His mind was racing, searching for one last, desperate gambit to regain control. He still had one more card to play, a secret that he believed would turn the town back to his side and condemn both Ilara and Silas forever. A secret he had been saving for just such a moment. The ropes fell away. Ilara collapsed, her legs giving out from under her. Silas caught her, quickly wrapping his own dusty coat around her bare shoulders, shielding her from the staring eyes. He held her steady, her body trembling uncontrollably, a mix of relief and trauma shaking her to the core. Blackwood saw his chance. With the girl free, he had to act now or lose everything. He raised his hands, not in prayer, but as if to quiet a frantic flock. His voice, once booming, was now laced with a desperate pleading tone. "Wait! You don't understand. This is not about what you think. This girl, she is not who she appears to be," he cried. The crowd, already confused, turned their attention back to him. "What now?" "She is a thief," Blackwood declared, pointing a shaking finger at Ilara. "She came into my chapel not to pray, but to steal from the house of God. I caught her with her hands in the collection box. That is why she attacked me, to silence me." This was a new accusation, a simpler one. More believable than demons and devils, stealing from the church. That was a sin everyone could understand. Murmurs started up again. A few heads nodded. Maybe that was it. Maybe this whole ugly business was just about a common thief. Sheriff Brody looked from the preacher to the exhausted girl leaning on Silas. "Is this true?" he asked her, his voice even. Ilara shook her head weakly. "No, he's lying. There was no money." She would say that, wouldn't she? Blackwood shot back, gaining confidence as he saw the seeds of doubt he'd planted begin to sprout. "Search the man who protects her. Search Silas. He must be her accomplice. They planned this together to rob our church." It was a brilliant, wicked move. It shifted the suspicion from himself to the town's reclusive hero. Silas was an outsider in his own way. It was plausible. The crowd looked at Silas, their expressions changing again. Was he really a savior? Or was he part of a criminal plot? Silas met their gazes without a word. He stood his ground, his arm still supporting Ilara. He didn't deny it. He didn't say anything at all. His silence was unnerving. "See?" Blackwood crowed. "He cannot deny it. They are partners in sin." Sheriff Brody stepped forward. "Silas, you got anything to say about this?" Silas finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. "Reverend, are you sure you want to talk about what's in that collection box?" Blackwood froze. The question was odd. The tone was chilling. There was a hidden meaning there, a threat that only he seemed to understand. His bravado vanished in an instant, replaced by a flicker of pure panic. "What? What are you talking about?" he stammered. "I'm talking about the ledgers," Silas said, his voice dropping even lower. "The ones you keep hidden under the floorboards beneath that box. The ones that show all the donations you've been collecting. From widows. From frightened farmers. The ones that detail every secret you've used to keep this town in your pocket." A dead silence fell over the square. This was a bomb exploding in their midst. The collection box wasn't just for coins. It was for blackmail. The preacher wasn't just a predator. He was a puppeteer, pulling the strings of the whole town. Blackwood's face went white as a sheet. "Lies! These are the ravings of a madman!" But the damage was done. People in the crowd started looking at each other, their eyes wide. Old Man Hemlock, who had suddenly donated his prime pasture land to the church last spring. The widow Maeve, who had given up her late husband's silver watch. Suddenly, a dozen little mysteries, a dozen acts of unexplained generosity toward the church started to make a horrible kind of sense. They weren't donations. They were payments. And then, a small voice cut through the tension. It was a young boy, no more than 10, standing near the front. "I saw it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I saw the preacher talking to my pa last week. He gave him a letter, and after, Pa was crying." The boy's father, a burly blacksmith, grabbed his son's shoulder, his face pale with fear. But it was too late. Another voice rose up, this time from an old seamstress. "The Reverend, he knew about my daughter, the one who left town. He said he would keep her secret safe as long as I helped fund his new chapel roof. Her voice broke on a sob. It was an avalanche. The secrets Blackwood had so carefully gathered and used as weapons were now being turned against him. One by one, people started speaking up, sharing stories of fear, of intimidation, of money and valuables given to the church under duress. The holy man was a racketeer. His church was a den of thieves. Blackwood staggered back, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape. The crowd that had adored him, feared him, obeyed him only minutes ago, was now a sea of accusing faces. They were no longer sheep. They were a pack of wolves that had just realized their shepherd was the one who'd been slaughtering them all along. The truth about the chapel, about the assault on Ilara, was now clear as day. She hadn't been stealing money. She must have stumbled upon his ledgers. She must have seen the truth. His attack wasn't born of lust. It was born of panic. He had to silence her, and when she fought back, he'd used the town's faith as his ultimate weapon. He looked at Silas, his eyes filled with a murderous hatred. Silas had known. He had known all along. This wasn't a chance encounter. Silas had come to town today for a reason. He had come to burn Blackwood's kingdom to the ground. "You!" Blackwood hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "This was you. You planned this." Silas simply nodded. "It's been a long time coming, Reverend. A debt is owed." "A debt? What debt?" Before anyone could ask, Blackwood made a final desperate move. He wasn't going down alone. With a wild cry, he lunged, not at Silas, but at Ilara. He grabbed her, pulling her from Silas's grasp and holding a small, sharp letter opener he'd produced from his sleeve to her throat. "Nobody moves!" he screamed, his eyes wild with terror. "Or the sinner dies for real this time!" The crowd recoiled in horror. The man of God was now a common kidnapper, holding a blade to a woman's throat in the town square. The transformation was complete. The monster was finally out in the open for everyone to see. Sheriff Brody's hand flew to his gun, but he couldn't get a clean shot. Silas stood frozen, his face a grim mask. Blackwood began to back away, dragging Ilara with him toward the chapel. "Get me a horse, now, or I swear I will cut her from ear to ear," he shrieked. His holy crusade had devolved into a desperate hostage situation. He had lost the town. He had lost his power. All he had left was a blade and a terrified girl. But he had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated Silas, and he had no idea why the old rancher had really come to town today. The debt Silas mentioned wasn't about money or blackmail. It was about blood. As Blackwood backed toward the church, his eyes darting everywhere, Silas took a single, calm step forward. "Let her go, Blackwood," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "It's me you want." Blackwood laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "You think I'm a fool? You've turned them all against me. I have nothing left." "You're wrong," Silas said. "You still have your life. But you won't for much longer if you harm her. You remember my sister, don't you, Blackwood?" The name hung in the air. The preacher's wild eyes focused on Silas, a flicker of confusion, then dawning recognition, and then pure, abject terror. He remembered. A girl from years ago in another town, before he'd come here. A girl who had died under mysterious circumstances. A girl who had been his first victim. "Sarah," Blackwood whispered, the name like a curse on his lips. "She was my younger sister," Silas said, his voice cracking with a grief that was decades old but still raw. "You did to her what you tried to do to this girl. But Sarah didn't fight back. She was too scared. The shame, it killed her. She walked into the river a week later. They called it an accident. But I knew. I read her diary." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was never about the town's secrets. It was about Silas's. He hadn't just stumbled upon Blackwood's scheme. He had been hunting him. For years. He had tracked him across 3 territories, waiting for the moment to expose him, to make him pay for the death of his sister. Ilara was just the catalyst, the spark that lit the fuse he had so patiently laid. "I've been waiting for you to show your true colors again," Silas continued, taking another slow step. "I knew you couldn't help yourself. I knew you'd find another innocent girl to torment. And I knew I had to be there when you did." The crowd listened, breathless. Their petty dramas of blackmail and stolen silver faded into nothing. This was a story of vengeance, of a brother's love and a patient, cold-blooded hunt for justice that had finally reached its end. Blackwood was trembling, the letter opener shaking in his hand. He was no longer a powerful preacher or a cunning blackmailer. He was just a cornered rat, facing the ghost of his past. The girl in his arms was no longer just a victim. She was a symbol of the sister Silas had lost. "Stay back!" Blackwood shrieked, pressing the blade harder against Ilara's skin, drawing a thin line of blood. "I'll do it! I swear I will!" Sheriff Brody raised his pistol, trying to get a sight line. "Don't be a fool, Blackwood, it's over!" But Silas raised a hand, stopping him. "No, this is between me and him." And then Silas did the last thing anyone expected. He unbuckled his gun belt. The heavy revolver and its belt full of cartridges fell to the dust with a soft thud. He stood before the armed preacher, completely defenseless. "No weapons," Silas said. "Just you and me. Let the girl go and you can face me, man to man, for Sarah." It was an insane gamble, but it was also a challenge to the last shred of Blackwood's twisted pride. For a moment the preacher stared, his mind racing. A horse was no guarantee of escape. The sheriff was a good shot. But this was a chance to silence the man who had ruined him. If he could take down Silas, maybe he could still salvage something from the wreckage. His eyes gleamed with a new feral light. He saw a path, a bloody, violent path, but a path nonetheless. Slowly, a wicked grin spread across his face. He shoved Ilara forward. She stumbled and fell to her knees. "Fine," Blackwood hissed, the letter opener still gripped tight in his hand. "For Sarah." He lunged, not at Silas, but past him, toward the sheriff's horse tied to a nearby post. It was a feint, a trick. He never intended to fight Silas. His plan was to get a horse and ride. The challenge was just a distraction to make Silas lower his guard. But he had misjudged his opponent. Again. Silas didn't move to intercept him. He just watched him go. As Blackwood scrambled for the horse's reins, a blur of motion came from the side. It was Ilara. She hadn't stayed on the ground. She had picked up a heavy rock from the dusty street. With a cry that was pure primal rage, she threw it with all her might. The rock struck Blackwood square in the back of the head. He grunted, stumbling forward, his head hitting the hitching post with a sickening crack. He collapsed into a heap, motionless, the letter opener clattering onto the ground beside him. For a moment, the entire town was silent. The great and powerful Reverend Blackwood, the voice of God, the terror of their community, had not been brought down by a vengeful gunslinger or the town sheriff. He had been felled by the very girl he had tried to destroy. Ilara stood there, panting, her eyes blazing. She had not been a damsel to be rescued. She had been a survivor who, in the end, had delivered her own justice. Sheriff Brody was the first to move. He cautiously approached the fallen preacher, nudging him with his boot. Blackwood was unconscious, but breathing. The law would deal with him now. Silas walked over to Ilara. He didn't say a word. He just gently took the coat he had given her and draped it more securely around her shoulders. She looked up at him, her breathing still ragged, her eyes filled with 1,000 emotions. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved yourself," Silas replied, his voice thick with emotion. He looked down at the pathetic figure of Blackwood, then back at her. In her eyes, he saw the same fire his sister Sarah had once had, before it had been extinguished. He had not been able to save his sister, but today he had helped save someone else, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The crowd began to stir, their shock giving way to a low murmur of shame and relief. They had been fooled. They had been complicit. They had almost let an innocent girl die while protecting a monster. They looked at Ilara, then at Silas, and then at their own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. The lesson of that day was burned into their minds. Blind faith was a fire that could warm you, but it could also burn your whole world down if you weren't careful who was tending the flames. The sheriff and a few men hauled the unconscious preacher off to the town jail. The cell that had been waiting for horse thieves and drunks would now hold a man who had stolen their souls. The crowd slowly dispersed, not talking, each person walking back to their homes with a heavy weight in their hearts. They had a lot to think about, a lot to reckon with. Silas helped Ilara onto his horse. She was weak, her skin was burned, and her body was bruised, but she sat tall. As they rode out of the town square, leaving the empty cross behind them like a scar on the landscape, she looked back one last time. It was a place of pain, but it was also the place where she had found her voice. They rode in silence for a while, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Silas took her not to his lonely ranch in the high country, but to the next town over, to a doctor he knew and trusted. He stayed with her until he was sure she was safe and cared for. Before he left, he pressed a small, leather-bound book into her hands. It was a diary. "This was my sister's," he said quietly. "I think she would have wanted you to have it, to know you weren't alone." Ilara took it, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the cover. She didn't know what her future held, where she would go from here. But she knew one thing for sure. She would never be silent again. She had faced down the devil in a black coat, and she had won. Silas rode back to his ranch under a sky full of stars. The long hunt was over. The debt had been paid. For the first time in 20 years, his heart felt a little lighter. Justice didn't always come from the barrel of a gun. Sometimes it came from the courage of a single voice refusing to be silenced and the strength of a girl with a rock in her hand. The town of Redemption, as it was called, was never the same. The chapel stayed empty for a long time. People started talking to each other more and listening a little closer. They learned that the loudest voices are often the ones hiding the darkest secrets. And they learned that true strength isn't about how loud you can preach, but about how bravely you can stand up for what's right, even when you're standing all alone. If you believe a story like this deserves to be heard, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and share it with someone you know. It helps more than you realize. And now, before we part ways, I just want to say thank you. I read your comments, and I see folks from all over the world tuning in, sometimes late into the night. Please, look after yourselves. A good story is meant to be a comfort, not a reason to lose sleep. Your health is the most important thing. I may be getting on in years, and my fingers aren't as quick to type replies as they used to be, but know that I appreciate every single one of you. Thank you for your time, and for keeping these stories from the Old West alive.